Hi, welcome to the 2021 ACE Conference. Today we're going to be presenting on what's the point, increasing student motivation towards higher education.
Introducing ourselves, my name is Morgan Hale. I teach high school math in Jacksonville, Florida. Hi everyone, I'm Tait McGlinn. I teach high school math in New York City.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Ryan. I teach high school physics in New Orleans.
Hi, my name is Julia Waldman, and I teach high school science in Santa Ana, California.
My name is Samantha Weil, and I teach middle school social studies and religion in Los Angeles.
I'm Alison O'Neill. I also teach middle school social studies in Atlanta. I'm going to briefly go over the topic overview and framing. So we're going to start off with operational definitions, talk about the terms we're going to be going through today, review the significance of our study and our literature in the field, and introduce a case study that's kind of woven throughout the whole thing. But first, let's kick it off to Sammy for operational definitions.
Thank you, Alison, for getting us started off. So today we're going to begin with some basic definitions that'll help lay the groundwork for how you can increase your students' motivation towards higher education. So when we're looking at increasing students' motivation towards higher education, we want to be increasing their motivations in any possible aspect, which is why our possibilities, our framework are going to be grounded in looking at two specific types of framework. The first of which is intrinsic motivation, which focuses on the satisfaction or pleasure that a student receives in performing a task. This could also be known as the natural drive that a student feels, the way in which they feel a personal responsibility to complete a task or to master a skill. We also, though, want to increase students' extrinsic motivation, the way that they respond to outside forces, so that they can accomplish this big goal. And so extrinsic motivation focuses on the grade, employment, or task. And we want to be looking, like I said, at how to increase both of these so that students are more likely to achieve a higher education degree. We'll also be talking about pedagogy. Pedagogy is known as the instructional tactics and methods utilized by teachers. And so pedagogy is a tangible thing that all educators can change so that students feel in the classroom, feel through their learning that they are capable of higher education, that they have the skills and tools to participate in that. And so that's something that I want you to keep in mind throughout the presentation. And lastly, when we say that we're increasing student motivation towards higher education, we are looking at both 2-year or 4-year college opportunities. So beyond high school, we want them to be achieving an educational outcome that will help them advance their goals towards a future career. And why is this important? This is important because as educators, you do have the opportunity to change your students' trajectory, both in the short term and the long term. And by changing the motivation that your students feel, both intrinsically and extrinsically in your classroom, you in the short term can give them the tools to help them achieve some of their dreams. And in the long term, these goals of achieving higher education and getting these opportunities can lead to long-term outcomes such as increased life satisfaction and job opportunities, as well as income. And our research shows, as you'll see in our next section here, that student motivation can be impacted and increased through these different frameworks. So during this presentation, we'll be looking at how you can change your school, your classroom community so that there is more parent involvement, so parents in and around the classroom and school support, so that looks at how the schools can put in structural programs to help your students, and lastly, exposure to opportunities, how you as a teacher have the ability to bring in other forces so that students feel the desire and the motivation to pursue a degree in higher education. And because of this, we wanted to bring in a case study so that you can see how these different frameworks can impact a student throughout our presentation. And so I'd like to introduce Alex, who is our case study student. Alex is in the 11th grade. He is a rising junior, and so about the age where students are beginning to really consider what their higher education opportunities look like. He is low income and first generation. He has a particular strength in math, and so he really excels in math. He would be interested in pursuing that opportunity, though he does struggle in English. And so those have impacted his motivation towards college in different ways. Lastly, he has low intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So he doesn't necessarily see at this point how higher education opportunities fit into the grand scheme of his life. So we're going to see how these different frameworks impact his intrinsic and his extrinsic motivation towards higher education. And lastly, he is considering college. And so we do have the opportunity here to increase his motivation so that he goes from considering to attending a 4-year or 2-year college if that is the right choice for him. And now I'm going to pass it off to Morgan to begin talking about our three possibilities within this framework.
Thanks for passing it off, Sammy. Now we're going to talk about the first of the 3 Ps, and that's pedagogy. So this is specifically tools that we can use in the classroom as teachers to try and increase motivation for our students. There are 2 tools that we're going to specifically discuss. The reality is there are many different tools for the sake of motivation, but for the sake of time, we're only going to talk about 2 of them. The first is more of like a specific tool within the classroom for the way in which students interact with the content. So as them, instead of just getting direct instruction all day, it's a specific mindset that we can take into the exercises that we craft for our students. And the second is going to be more about how student self-beliefs, so beliefs about themselves, how that interacts and how that meshes with the way in which they engage with the content. So 2 very different types of pedagogical tools. We are going to split them up, and I think they shed some light on the different aspects of the classroom that we can really push student motivation. So the first that we're going to talk about is gamification. It's from an article by Banfield and Wilkerson. If you're trying to understand what this idea of gamification is, it's quite simple. It's really just taking any exercise that you would usually engage with or usually give your students and giving it some component that is game-like. So whether that's leaderboards, whether that is points, it's just taking any exercise that naturally would occur in a classroom, but reworking it and rebranding it so it gives the illusion of participating in a game, as if you're competing in some respect. Underlying any of these discussions of motivation, right? One of the things that we're really trying to get at is the difference between intrinsic motivation for our students and extrinsic motivation for our students, right? This idea of intrinsic motivation is doing it from the self, doing it for the sake of the exercise, and extrinsic being there is some reward. So when we're talking about gamifying, there is this notion of me providing you points and me providing a leaderboard kind of adds an extrinsic motivator to the system. It's providing the students something to work towards instead of working from themselves. But the goal of this study was to say, okay, we can already assume that if we add gamified components, the students will be more extrinsically motivated. The question is, if we continue to provide gamified exercises at the end of a semester, at the end of a course, will students show more of these intrinsic indicators? So the idea being, by getting students more engaged with the content on a class-by-class basis, over the course of an entire class, do they become more intrinsically motivated? That was the question that Banfield and Wilkerson were concerned with. And the results are, in many respects, quite simple. The answer is yes, in all respects. If I gamify a course, okay, if I gamify the exercises that students partake in over the course of a semester, 25 to 2 report all of the exercises as being more fun. And at a very base level, if it's more fun, they're more likely to engage with the content. At the end of the semester, 56 to 3 reported that in the gamified exercises, they were more likely and more able to refer to previous knowledge that they had gained in the class, right? And so when we talk about scaffolding and continually building on the content that our students already know, in a gamified system, students on a vast majority reported they were more able to achieve that goal. And lastly, and this is the big one, this is the key for our presentation, 92% of students, when they were given this gamified course, when they were given these gamified exercises, at the end of the course, 92% showed intrinsic motivation tendencies, or they had certain themes in the way that they talked about how they were engaging with the material and how they were studying for classes thereon after, as opposed to 31%, right? 31% of students who had just been given the traditional didactic, I stand at a board and I give you information type of type of class. And so we see across the board, right? Across the board. Yes, in an individual exercise, a gamified class gives you more of an extrinsic motivator, but as you repeat that process, students repeatedly are more engaged, they care more about the class, they buy into it at a much higher level, and so they increase these intrinsic motivators, they increase this desire to learn the content. The second pedagogical tool that we're going to talk about is self-affirmation strategies. This is from an article by Brady. And the study was quite simple. They gave students once a semester about 15 minutes just to talk about a core value that they particularly cared about themselves. Okay, and the question that they asked was, if we give these students value training, so if we get these students to think about what values they bring into the classroom, will that in some way help the motivation? Will this help the academic performance of students? And specifically, will it help our minority students? So the study was quite simple. Like I said, they had Latino and white college students. They were given these value affirmation trainings or programs over the course of the year. And they just measured at the end of the year how these students, right? They measured how these students spoke about the way that they dealt with academic stressors, how they engaged with their material over the course of the class, et cetera, et cetera. And what they found was, again, quite simple. Even as simple as a single affirmation intervention, a single sit down with a student and having them write about the values that they bring to the classroom, it resulted in increased GPAs by the end of the semester. It resulted in students reliving that self-affirmation over and over. And it also just increased a stronger sense of adequacy, belonging, and motivation. Now, they found these results for specifically their Latino students, so specifically their minority students. For their white students, they did find other benefits as well, but they noted that it wasn't as strong of a response as for the Latino students. So when we're talking about, for Alex, our case study here, when we're thinking about that student that we have, it's really important, right, to see class as more than just a requirement. We want to get our students bought in. We want to get them to care about what they're doing. And so when we're potentially preparing for college, in the context of Alex, we need to help him work towards this sense of intrinsic motivation. And the only way that he's going to do that is if we can get him to buy in, whether we're gamifying, whether we get him to think about what values he brings to our classroom. And especially if Alex, in this case, is a minority student, it's important for him to feel like he belongs in our classroom. And something like these value affirmation trainings really, really help aid that. So we're now going to pass it off to Julia, and we will talk about parents.
All right, thank you, Morgan, for that presentation. We're going to move in now into looking at the role that parents can play in motivating their children to attend college. As we're looking at this role of parents, again, it's vital that we remember that parents are the primary educator of their children, and we recognize that they are the first and most important educator. And it's also then, so it's critical that as teachers, we maintain a positive relationship with our parents to kind of uphold this belief. We're going to look at a couple studies here about the role that parents play in motivating their children. And so this first one here is a case study of 7 first-generation college students. And what they did is they looked at the role that parents had on motivating these students towards college. And what these researchers found was that when parents emphasized early education, expectations for college, and high standards, student motivation increased. Additionally, we saw that when parents were supportive in helping the student seek out resources for college, the student was more motivated to attend college. From this, we can take away that their parents' expectations for their students play a big role in student motivation. And when parents help students attend college, we see positive impact there. The second study is looking at data on 10th grade students and looking at sort of their general academic motivation. So here we looked at engagement, intrinsic motivation, and self-efficacy towards both math and English. And similar to the last study, we saw that when parents had high aspirations for their students, student motivation increased. And interestingly, we saw that when schools reached out to parents with good reports or other information, for example, college prep classes, we saw that student motivation increased. But when schools reached out to parents about problematic behavior and parents kind of only got negative reports, we saw that actually had a negative impact on student motivation. So practical takeaways here, when thinking about how we can interact with our parents, is that schools should contact parents with information on resources, opportunities, and student success, not just reaching out with negative behavior. And this is in line with a lot of the formation, a lot of the teaching that we've had here at ACE. So kind of thinking about Alex then and what this means for him, it's important that we keep Alex and his parents informed about resources for college or other post-grad possibilities. This is especially true because Alex is a first-generation student, and so his parents might not have had the experience of attending college, and so they might be going through this process for the first time as well. And again, just sharing Alex's success with his parents. We mentioned at the beginning that he's good at math, so kind of supporting him in that math, reaching out to his parents when he does well on English, really celebrating him and encouraging him. Right now, we're going to move on to Tait, and he is going to share with us the role of possibilities.
All right, thank you, Julia, for the introduction here. Next, we're going to talk about supports from some literature regarding possibilities. We'll get into more about exactly what possibilities means. But the question we're trying to answer in this section is how can teachers and the school community itself impact student motivation towards further steps in education or even careers. So with the first study that we looked at, we were looking at this report from Destin and Costco. And this is a meta-analysis researching higher education and high school student motivation. And if you don't know what a meta-analysis is, it's basically instead of conducting an experiment or getting data themselves, these researchers looked at a bunch of different papers and kind of compiled the research and then draw conclusions from that. And specifically, this focused on students that had a low socioeconomic status and some unique challenges in their schools. The first topic that we want to talk about in terms of how motivation increases with regard to kind of some professional or financial outcomes. Alumni or professionals there, bringing those people in that had success themselves, having them come into the classroom or come into the school and discuss their own experience with students, increase student motivation, and just knowledge when students were informed of other paths, financial opportunities such as trade school or financial aid at a four-year university or work study program that could help pay their way through college, or specific career fairs that opened up some opportunities to them. Students were more motivated after hearing about those opportunities. Two more outcomes from this meta-analysis that they did. Educators and professionals having a conversation about growth mindset. We talked a lot about growth mindset in terms of success and possibilities not being something fixed and being able to jump into those opportunities, specifically here towards status, mainly here economic status. Having that growth mindset towards status, or having someone come in and talk about how it's possible to get through that barrier, increase student motivation there. And finally here, the concepts from class, whether it's those talks that they had, connecting those to real world examples of people who experience status mobility, increase student motivation there. So seeing or talking about success in that conversation towards growth mindset, and then connecting that to a tangible example that students can really ground that in, so making that a real thing for them. Next, we want to talk a little bit about this study from Cook and his team. In this study, they surveyed 243 urban high schools, and they looked at the school counselor in specific terms, looking at schools that had more than 10% Latinx students here. Looking at the results here, the motivation tended to increase when Teachers highlighted Latinx, specifically English language learners, the achievements in school-wide newsletters or publications. So making sure that their successes are kind of glorified, or just celebrating their successes on a school-wide level. Next, when the schools organize workshops for these English language learner parents to discuss future opportunities, so essentially educating the parents on what their students or their children could be doing, student motivation then tended to increase. That kind of was like a trickle-down effect there. And then finally, when parents of those various professions came in to speak with those students, specifically English language learners there. And it's kind of similar to what we just talked about in the last study, the professionals coming into the classroom regarding career paths, opportunities, and just to inform these students about what they really could be doing with their lives after high school. Motivation increased as well. So just a few points there. Some practical takeaways that we should be aware of in our classroom. It is always important to highlight student achievement, not necessarily academic grades or numbers, but effort, looking more towards that mastery development rather than the performance-based, which we know helps students in terms of motivation and growth. And then promoting that adoption of a growth mindset, specifically towards status, is going to be very important. Finally, we should make an effort to bring in resources into our classroom, whether it's people or programs that can inform our students more about the career opportunities that they could get, or connect them with people that can mentor them or provide a good role model for them in our local community. Specifically for our guy, Alex here, we're trying to facilitate his interests. So having a conversation with him about what his aspirations are outside of college, whether it's after someone's come into the classroom and talk to him, say, hey, was that interesting to you? Or if we know that he likes science and math, maybe bring in a professional related to that field of study that can help him kind of discern whether or not that's right for him. And finally, just making sure he's in contact with the college counselor at your school, if you have one, is going to help him work through some of the questions that he has and help him, or at least inform him about some opportunities that he can pursue. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Jimmy, who's going to wrap us up here.
All right, now that we've heard a little bit about the 3 Ps, let's think about the implications this has for us as teachers in our different content areas. One thing that we can do as teachers is work with our administration for our school and within our own classroom to bring in guest speakers to share their stories of success in various fields. This could be someone who's an alumnus or alumna of your school, sharing a story about their college experience or work experience. Could be a local professional, or perhaps even a politician, which would be especially helpful for a history or social studies class. This could even go back to a friend you know from your own college experience who happens to work in a relevant field for your students. Or you could even reach out to parents of your students so that they can share their stories in the classroom. Also, we as teachers must establish good communication with our parents and students. With parents, this can follow a regular schedule where we share things that are positive about our students, not just the negative things. We hear this in ACE to connect with our parents, make sure we're partnering with them, sharing positive feedback about our students and their successes and strengths in the classroom. We also need to tell parents and students about resources and opportunities for them, especially for us as teachers of juniors and seniors as they're finishing high school and perhaps moving on to college or into the workforce. And we can partner with the school guidance counselor, if you happen to have one, that we can make sure that all students know of college opportunities and other resources that are available for them. We also just want to be transparent with our students when we're communicating standards and expectations, and when we're communicating with home, so that they know what's going on and that we are trying to communicate the best for them. One implication in particular for STEM fields is that there are several companies and organizations who provide curricula or support classrooms with certain curricula. So my school, for instance, uses Project Lead the Way for an engineering class. There's also a FIRST robotics team at my school. And these curricula provide a great opportunity for students to engage in challenges that other students across the country also participate in. Tait's school did a computer science class sponsored by Amazon Web Services and their Educate program. So companies and organizations want students to pursue STEM fields in a fun and challenging fashion so they can go on to college and higher education and into the workforce as STEM scientists, engineers, and workers. Really, to sum all this up, it is worth it for students to go to college. This is why we want to motivate them in school to go to higher education. Research shows that completing one's education at a four-year college or university, or even at a community college, correlates with higher earnings, better health, decreased crime, and other benefits to students. And on top of this, this positive effect is increased for students whose background makes them less likely to complete higher education. Students like our case study Alex, who come from a low SES background, it is more effective for them to go to college or a university. Now over to Alison for our discussion questions.
All right, so now that everybody has reviewed the literature and talked about some of the practical applications of this research, I want to go through a couple of discussion questions before we wrap up here today. So our first two discussion questions deal a little bit more with these, again, these practical concerns. So our first question is, consider a unit that you've already planned, or perhaps a program that already exists in your school. Which one of the strategies that we discussed today might you foresee implementing? And going off of that, how could you implement it, right? Administration-wise or pedagogically, how could you implement that strategy that we choose? And our second discussion question is, on the flip side of that, kind of, what is a challenge that you foresee possibly in implementing this strategy? Could it be a funding issue? Could it be some kind of logistical issue? Every new strategy comes with challenges. And so with every new thing we want to try, we got to think about also what are the trade-offs, both important things to consider here. And then our third discussion question is a little bit different, looking at more broadly the, I guess you could say, the effects of this research or how we could apply it to society as a whole. And so we think that, contemporary American education emphasizes four-year college. That is really strongly the trend that we see. And it's kind of emphasized over other post-secondary educational options like gap years or perhaps trade school, which could also be viable options for students. And how can we as educators help students become more aware of the real breadth of options that's available to them, right? They could go in a lot of different directions. So how can we encourage that? But on the flip side of that, should traditional college be considered over other options, and why or why not? Just things to consider as we wrap up here today. So we have our list of references here, and we just want to say thank you to everybody who is attending the ACE conference, and we will see you soon for discussion.